It was January 2024 when Mike Holloway, a newlywed and eager for a change, took a job on a sprawling cattle ranch in West Texas. Mike had grown up in Houston, far removed from the rugged rural life, but he had always dreamed of escaping the noise and bustle of the city for something simpler, quieter. The job seemed perfect, a live-in position with good pay, plenty of fresh air, and no traffic jams in sight. The ranch, known locally as Whispering Pines, spanned thousands of acres, with dusty trails winding through fields of mesquite and sparse clusters of pine trees. Its owner, a gruff old man named Virgil Hale, had inherited the property from his grandfather. Hale was a man of few words, but his quiet authority demanded respect. "Welcome to the ranch," Virgil said on Mike's first day, his handshake firm and his eyes sharp. "There's only one rule you need to remember here. Stay out of the grave stand. It's bad land, and we don't go there for any reason." Mike hesitated, confused. The grave stand? Virgil pointed to the east, where a dense thicket of trees loomed against the horizon. "You'll know it when you see it. If the land starts to feel wrong, turn back." Mike nodded, unsure what to make of the warning. He figured it was some kind of local superstition, or maybe just a way to keep people out of hazardous terrain. Over the next few weeks, Mike settled into his new life on the ranch. His co-workers were a mixed bunch. Tex, a middle-aged man with a booming laugh. Sarah, the no-nonsense wrangler who could handle a horse better than most men. And Ben, a quiet, wiry man who had been working on the ranch for over 20 years. For the most part, the work was straightforward: herding cattle, repairing fences, and maintaining the property. But every now and then, someone would mention the grave stand in hushed tones, their expressions darkening. "What's the deal with that place?" Mike asked one night as they sat around the campfire. Ben glanced at him, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "It's cursed land," he said simply. "Bad things happen there." Tex chuckled nervously. "Bad things don't even cover it. People go in there and don't come out. Animals avoid it too. I've seen deer and coyotes stop dead in their tracks at the edge of those trees, like something's warning them not to go any further." The stories stuck with Mike, though he tried to brush them off as old rancher tales. But his curiosity got the better of him when, one morning, Virgil tasked him and Sarah with repairing a section of fence near the grave stand. As they approached the area, Mike felt an odd sense of unease. The land seemed different here. The grass was patchy, and the trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. "This is as close as we get," Sarah said, stopping abruptly. She pointed to a section of the fence that was barely within the shadow of the grave stand. "We'll fix it from here." Mike glanced at the trees. He thought he saw movement, a shadow darting between the trunks, but when he blinked, it was gone. "Come on," Sarah snapped, her tone sharp. "We don't linger here." That night, as Mike lay in his bunk, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The ranch house was quiet except for the faint creak of the windmill outside, but the unease from earlier still clung to him. He dreamed of the grave stand, of walking through the twisted trees and finding a clearing where the ground was blackened and barren. In the center of the clearing was a pit, impossibly dark and deep, with whispers rising from its depths. Mike woke with a start, his heart pounding. He told himself it was just a dream, but it felt too real. The following week, Virgil sent Mike and Ben to round up some stray cattle near the east fence. As they rode their horses along the perimeter, Mike spotted a gap in the fence leading into the grave stand. "Looks like something broke through," he said, pointing to the torn wire. Ben frowned. "We'll fix it later. Let's find those cattle first." But as they searched the area, the cattle were nowhere to be found. Ben's horse began to act skittish, its ears pinned back and its nostrils flaring. "We're too close," Ben muttered, tugging the reins. "We need to head back." Just as they turned to leave, a low, guttural growl echoed from the trees. Both men froze, their horses shifting uneasily. "What was that?" Mike whispered. "Nothing good," Ben replied, his voice tense. "Let's move." But before they could, something burst from the trees, a blur of movement that sent the horses into a frenzy. Mike barely managed to stay in the saddle as his horse reared, its eyes wide with terror. When the dust settled, the thing was gone. But the damage was done. "We're done here," Ben said, his face pale. "Let's go." Over the next few days, strange things began to happen around the ranch. Tools went missing, only to be found mangled and broken. Cattle were spooked for no apparent reason, their eyes rolling wildly in their heads. And every night, Mike heard faint whispers outside his window, though no one was ever there. Then, one evening, Virgil gathered the ranch hands. "We've lost too many cattle to whatever's out there," he said grimly. "We're going to the grave stand. Tonight." The group set out after sundown, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. As they entered the grave stand, the air grew colder, and the whispers Mike had heard before returned, louder and more insistent. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The ground beneath their boots was soft and damp, as if they were walking on something rotten. In the center of the grove, they found it, a massive pit, its edges jagged and raw. The whispers rose from its depths, a cacophony of voices that made Mike's skin crawl. Then, the growling began. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall and emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long and its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "What in God's name is that?" Tex whispered, his voice trembling. The creature let out a bone-chilling roar and lunged toward them. Chaos erupted as the group scattered, their flashlights swinging wildly. Mike ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he dodged between the trees. Behind him, he could hear the creature pursuing them, its growls reverberating through the grove. They barely made it out alive. When they regrouped at the ranch house, they were battered and shaken, but alive. Virgil didn't say a word about what they'd seen, but the grave look in his eyes said it all. The next day, Mike packed his bags. He never went back to Whispering Pines, but he still dreams of the grave stand, the pit, the whispers, and the creature that lurks in the shadows. And every time he passes a thicket of trees, he can't help but wonder if they're watching. The summer of 2024 had been a scorcher, and the small Texas town of Blackwood was wilting under the relentless heat. Tucked between endless stretches of ranchland and thick forests, Blackwood was a place where everyone knew each other, and little ever changed. It was the perfect place for Madison King to escape. After a rough year in Dallas that included a messy breakup and a layoff, she decided to take a much-needed vacation at her aunt's cabin in Blackwood Canyon, a remote area just outside town. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking dense woods, offering solitude and breathtaking views. A perfect place to clear her head. But Blackwood Canyon had its secrets. On her first evening at the cabin, Madison unpacked her things and sat on the porch with a cold glass of sweet tea. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trees below. She noticed how quiet it was. No distant hum of traffic, no barking dogs, just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. As the sun dipped lower, Madison spotted movement in the woods. A figure, tall, thin, and pale, moved between the trees, almost blending with the fading light. She squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, but the figure was gone before she could be sure it was ever there. "That's what you get for staring too long," she muttered to herself, shaking it off. The next morning, Madison drove into town to stock up on supplies. She stopped by the local diner for breakfast, where she struck up a conversation with the waitress, an older woman named Clara. "You're staying up in the canyon?" Clara asked, her tone neutral but her expression wary. Madison nodded. "At my aunt's cabin. I'll be there for a couple of weeks." Clara hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Just be careful up there. Strange things happen in those woods." Madison raised an eyebrow. "What kind of strange things?" Clara shrugged. "People hear things, see things that don't make sense. My advice? Don't go wandering too far from the cabin." That night, Madison couldn't sleep. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind picked up outside, and the shadows cast by the moon seemed to dance on the walls. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when a soft noise caught her attention. A faint tapping, like fingernails against glass. Madison sat up, her heart racing. The sound was coming from the window near the kitchen. She grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the noise, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She hesitated before pulling back the curtain, half expecting to see a branch swaying in the wind. Instead, she saw a face. It was only there for a moment, a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes and thin, cracked lips. It stared at her through the glass, unmoving, before fading into the darkness. Madison stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she scrambled to lock all the doors and windows. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, but the image of that face lingered in her mind. Over the next few days, Madison tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. But strange things kept happening. Objects in the cabin seemed to move on their own. A chair shifted slightly, a picture frame turned upside down. She heard faint whispers at night, too quiet to make out the words, but loud enough to keep her awake. On the fourth day, Madison decided to explore the canyon, hoping a hike would help clear her head. She followed a narrow trail that wound through the woods, the air thick and humid. About an hour in, she came across an old, overgrown clearing. In the center stood a crumbling stone structure, what looked like the remains of a well. The well was surrounded by strange markings carved into the stones, symbols that Madison didn't recognize. The air around it felt colder, heavier, and a faint metallic smell lingered. Madison stepped closer, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Peering into the well, she saw nothing but darkness. She tossed a small rock inside, expecting to hear it hit the bottom. It didn't. Instead, the air around her seemed to shift, and she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. She turned quickly, her flashlight scanning the trees. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the figure she'd seen on her first night. It didn't move, but Madison could feel its gaze boring into her. She stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps, and sprinted back toward the trail. When she reached the cabin, she locked herself inside and grabbed her phone to call her aunt. "There's something out here," Madison said, her voice trembling. "Something in the woods." Her aunt was quiet for a moment before responding. "Stay inside. Don't go back to the well. And whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers." That night, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from all around the cabin, rising and falling like a twisted chorus. Madison huddled in the corner of the living room, clutching a kitchen knife and praying for dawn. But dawn didn't bring relief. The whispers followed her throughout the day, growing louder whenever she approached the windows. Desperate, Madison decided to leave the cabin and drive back to town. But as she stepped onto the porch, she saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing silently at the edge of the woods. Their faces were pale and hollow, their bodies thin and frail. They stood motionless, their empty eyes fixed on her. Madison backed into the cabin, slamming the door shut. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and Madison felt the walls of the cabin closing in. By nightfall, the figures were closer, their gaunt faces illuminated by the moonlight. Madison knew she couldn't stay. She grabbed her car keys and bolted out the back door, sprinting to her truck. The figures didn't move to stop her, but their presence was suffocating. As she sped down the dirt road, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The figures were gone, but the whispers remained, echoing in her ears long after she reached the safety of town. Madison never returned to the cabin. When she told her story to the locals, they exchanged uneasy glances but offered no answers. Years later, Madison still hears the whispers in her dreams, always leading her back to the well in Blackwood Canyon. She wakes with a start, her heart pounding, and vows never to go near that cursed place again. Some places, she's learned, are better left alone. When I was a child, my grandfather, Henry "Hank" Barrow, used to tell me stories about his life growing up in the piney woods of East Texas. Most of his tales were harmless, adventures in the woods, pranks on his siblings, or encounters with stubborn livestock. But there was one story he only told me once. His expression grew dark as he spoke, and I could see the fear etched into his face even after all those years. It was the summer of 1954, and my grandfather was 12 years old. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of Black Hollow, a rural community surrounded by thick, sprawling forests. The woods were his playground, a place where he and his friends would climb trees, build forts, and hunt for small game. But there was one part of the woods they never ventured into: the Hollow Thicket. The Hollow Thicket was a dense, shadowy area about a mile from my grandfather's house. The trees there grew unnaturally close together, their gnarled branches forming a canopy so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. Locals whispered that the thicket was cursed, a place where bad things happened. Livestock that wandered into the area often disappeared, and hunters swore they heard whispers in the wind when they ventured too close. My grandfather didn't believe in curses, at least not until the summer everything changed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Hank and his best friend, Jimmy, decided to go squirrel hunting. Armed with their .22 rifles, they headed into the woods, following a well-worn trail that looped around the Hollow Thicket. As they walked, the air grew cooler, and an unnatural stillness settled over the forest. Even the usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves seemed to fade away. Hank felt a chill creep up his spine, but he shrugged it off, attributing it to the approaching night. They were about half a mile from the thicket when they heard it, a faint, melodic humming, like someone singing a lullaby. "Who's out here singing?" Jimmy whispered, his voice barely audible. Hank shook his head, motioning for Jimmy to be quiet. The humming grew louder, and as they crept closer, they saw a figure standing at the edge of the Hollow Thicket. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She wore a tattered black dress that hung loosely on her thin frame, and her long, unkempt hair obscured most of her face. Her arms were outstretched, and she swayed gently as she hummed. Hank and Jimmy froze, their instincts screaming at them to run. "What do we do?" Jimmy hissed. "Just back away," Hank replied, his voice trembling. But before they could move, the woman stopped humming. She turned her head slightly, as if sensing their presence, and let out a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down their spines. The boys bolted, tearing through the woods as fast as their legs could carry them. They didn't stop until they reached Hank's house, their chests heaving and their hearts pounding. When Hank told his parents what they'd seen, his father's face darkened. "You stay out of those woods," he said firmly, "especially near the Hollow Thicket." The incident shook Hank, but curiosity gnawed at him. Who was the woman? Why was she out there? And what was she doing? Despite his father's warning, Hank couldn't resist the urge to investigate further. A few weeks later, Hank ventured into the woods alone, this time during the day. He stayed close to the edges of the Hollow Thicket, his eyes scanning the dense foliage for any signs of the woman. That's when he found it, a small, makeshift hut made of branches and animal hides hidden among the trees. The air around it was heavy, almost oppressive, and the faint smell of decay lingered. Hank approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. Peeking through a gap in the branches, he saw strange symbols carved into the wooden beams of the hut. Animal bones hung from the ceiling, strung together like morbid wind chimes. In the center of the hut was a fire pit, its ashes still warm. Hank's stomach churned as he realized someone had been there recently. He turned to leave but froze when he heard a soft, raspy voice behind him. "You shouldn't be here." Hank spun around and came face to face with the woman. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and stretched tightly over her bones. Her eyes were dark and empty, like twin voids that seemed to pull him in. She reached out a bony hand, her cracked lips curling into a twisted smile. Hank didn't wait to see what she wanted. He ran, the sound of her laughter echoing behind him. For weeks after that encounter, Hank was plagued by nightmares. He dreamed of the woman standing at the foot of his bed, her hollow eyes watching him as he slept. Strange things began happening around the house, doors opening and closing on their own, shadows moving in the corners of his vision. The final straw came one night when Hank woke to find scratches on his bedroom window, as if something, or someone, had been trying to get in. His father decided they'd had enough. The family packed their belongings and moved to a neighboring town, leaving the Hollow Thicket and its sinister inhabitant behind. Years later, when Hank returned to Black Hollow as an adult, He learned that the woman's hut had been destroyed in a fire. But the stories persisted. Locals claimed to hear her humming in the woods, and some swore they saw her wandering near the hollow thicket on moonless nights. To this day, Hank refuses to go near the area, even in broad daylight. And every time he tells the story, he ends it the same way. Some things are better left alone. In the summer of 2024, Lucas Taylor took a seasonal job at the Pine Ridge Nature Reserve, a sprawling 8,000-acre stretch of wilderness in the heart of East Texas. The reserve, known for its dense pine forests and winding trails, was a hotspot for hikers and nature enthusiasts. But it also had its fair share of mysteries: missing persons, unexplained lights, and whispers of things lurking deep in the woods. Lucas wasn't from the area, but he needed the work. Fresh out of college and low on cash, the job seemed like a perfect opportunity to earn money and get away from city life. The duties were straightforward: clearing invasive plants, maintaining trails, and occasionally assisting visitors. But it was the camaraderie with his coworkers, particularly his partner Joe Alvarez, that made the job enjoyable. Joe was a local, born and raised in the small town of Pine Creek, just outside the reserve. He was in his late 30s, a bit gruff, but with a dry sense of humor that kept their long days in the sun bearable. Joe knew the woods better than anyone, often pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the reserve's history. But there was one area even Joe avoided: a remote section of the forest known as Hollow's Bend. Hollow's Bend wasn't marked on the reserve's official maps. It was a dense thicket of pine and oak trees, cut off from the main trails by a rocky ravine. Joe said it was a dangerous area, prone to flash floods and sinkholes, and not worth the risk. Besides, Joe had said one afternoon as they worked to clear a patch of kudzu, there's something about that place. It just feels wrong. Lucas had laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to local superstition, but his curiosity was piqued. One humid afternoon in late July, Lucas and Joe were assigned to clear debris from an old firebreak trail near the edge of Hollow's Bend. The trail hadn't been used in years, and it was overgrown with thorny vines and fallen branches. As they worked, the forest grew unusually quiet. The hum of cicadas faded, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze seemed to stop altogether. Lucas noticed Joe glancing around uneasily, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a nervous tension. "You okay?" Lucas asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Joe nodded, but his eyes didn't leave the tree line. "Let's just finish up and get out of here." The stillness was unnerving, but Lucas pushed through it, determined to get the job done. They were about halfway down the trail when they heard it, a sharp snapping sound, like a branch breaking underfoot. Lucas froze, his pulse quickening. "Did you hear that?" Joe nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the machete strapped to his belt. "Stay close," he whispered. The snapping continued, growing louder and closer. Lucas scanned the trees, expecting to see a deer or a hiker who'd wandered off the main trail. But there was nothing. Then came the whispers, faint at first, like the sound of wind moving through the trees. But as Lucas strained to listen, he realized they weren't natural. The whispers were low and rhythmic, words spoken in a language he didn't recognize. Joe grabbed Lucas's arm. "We're leaving. Now." Lucas didn't argue. They gathered their tools and began making their way back toward the main trail. But as they walked, the forest seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sunlight. The air grew heavy, and the faint smell of decay lingered. "We're going the wrong way," Lucas said, glancing at his GPS. Joe shook his head. "No, we're not. This trail should take us straight back." But the trail didn't lead back. Instead, it looped endlessly, the same patch of trees and rocks appearing over and over again. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, echoing all around them. Lucas's flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the darkness. Then Joe stopped abruptly. Ahead of them, sitting on a fallen tree, was a figure. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and waxy. It sat motionless, its head cocked to the side as if studying them. Joe stepped forward, his machete raised. "Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Instead, it let out a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down Lucas's spine. Without warning, the figure lunged, disappearing into the trees with an unnatural speed. Lucas and Joe ran, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor as the whispers and laughter followed them. In their panic, they became separated. Lucas stopped, his chest heaving as he called out for Joe. "Joe, where are you?" No response. Desperate, Lucas retraced his steps, shouting Joe's name into the oppressive silence. Finally, he spotted a faint light through the trees. He pushed through the undergrowth and found Joe sitting on a tree stump, his face pale and blank. "Joe, thank God," Lucas said, rushing over. But Joe didn't respond. His eyes were wide, staring straight ahead, and his hands trembled. "Joe, what happened?" Lucas asked, shaking his shoulder. Joe's lips moved, but the words were barely audible. It spoke to me." Lucas helped Joe to his feet, and together they stumbled back to the trailhead. When they finally emerged from the forest, the whispers stopped and the oppressive weight lifted. The reserve's director sent Joe home for the rest of the season, citing exhaustion. Lucas stayed on, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something in the woods was watching him. A few weeks later, Lucas read a news article about a hiker who had gone missing near Hollow's Bend. The search party found no trace of him, except for a single, waxy footprint near the edge of the forest. Lucas never returned to the reserve after that summer. But sometimes, late at night, he dreams of the whispers and the figure in the woods. And in those dreams, he hears Joe's voice, trembling and afraid. "It spoke to me." In the outskirts of a small Texas town called Pine Hollow, there was a legend about a house. A place so terrifying it was spoken of in hushed tones and only dared visited by those looking for a thrill. Locals called it the house on Valley Ridge Road, though it had no official name. No one knew who built it or why it was abandoned, but one thing was certain: strange and horrifying things happened inside. In the summer of 2024, Emily Carter and her boyfriend, Chris, were in the mood for a scare. They'd spent the last few weeks binge-watching horror movies, but nothing had quite scratched their itch for real fear. When a mutual friend, Tyler, mentioned the infamous house on Valley Ridge, Emily's curiosity was piqued. "They say it's haunted," Tyler explained, a mischievous grin on his face. "People go in, but not everyone comes out." Chris scoffed. "Come on, Ty. It's just an old house. What's the big deal?" Tyler leaned in closer. "The big deal is, it's not just a haunted house. It's a test. People say there's 13 rooms, each scarier than the last. If you make it through all 13, you win something." "Something?" Emily asked, raising an eyebrow. Tyler shrugged. "No one knows. No one's ever made it to the end." That night, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the house. Part of her wanted to believe it was just a silly urban legend, but another part, the adventurous, thrill-seeking part, wanted to see it for herself. A week later, Emily, Chris, Tyler, and their friend Sarah piled into Chris's old pickup and drove to Valley Ridge Road. The road was long and desolate, winding through stretches of overgrown farmland and dense woods. When they finally arrived, the house stood like a black shadow against the moonlit sky. It was enormous, with peeling paint, broken windows, and a sagging porch that seemed to groan under its own weight. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah asked, her voice wavering. Emily nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. "We came this far. Might as well." The front door creaked loudly as Chris pushed it open. Inside, the air was damp and musty, and the faint scent of mildew clung to everything. The entryway was dark, save for the beams of their flashlights cutting through the gloom. A sign hung on the wall, its faded letters barely legible. "Welcome. Face your fears." "This is so cheesy," Chris said with a laugh. But the laughter stopped when they heard the first door slam, shut behind them. The first room was deceptively simple, an empty living room with old, moth-eaten furniture and wallpaper peeling in long strips. But as they stepped inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the faint sound of whispering filled the air. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, clutching Emily's arm. Emily nodded, her flashlight trembling slightly. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, overlapping in an eerie, unintelligible chorus. When they opened the door to the next room, the whispers stopped. The second room was filled with mannequins, each one dressed in tattered clothes. They stood in various poses, their blank faces turned toward the group as if watching. "This is so freaky," Tyler muttered. As they walked through the room, the mannequins seemed to shift positions, though no one saw them move. By the time they reached the far door, one of the mannequins was blocking their path. "Okay, this isn't funny," Chris said, pushing the mannequin aside. But as soon as the door opened, the lights flickered and all the mannequins turned to face them. The third room was worse. It was a nursery, filled with dusty toys and a crib in the center of the room. The faint sound of a lullaby played from an old music box on the floor. Emily picked up the music box, her hands shaking. The moment she touched it, the lullaby stopped, replaced by the sound of a baby crying. "Let's keep moving," Chris said, his voice tight. As they turned to leave, the crib rocked violently, slamming against the floor as the crying grew louder. Each room seemed to play on a different fear. In one, they walked through a dark, maze-like hallway where they felt unseen hands brushing against their skin. In another, they were bombarded with loud, piercing screams that echoed endlessly. By the time they reached the 10th room, the group was on edge. Tyler refused to go any further, sitting on the floor with his head in his hands. "I can't," he said. "I can't do it." "Fine," Chris snapped. "Stay here. We're almost done." Emily, Chris, and Sarah pressed on, but the rooms only grew more horrifying. The 11th room was pitch black, save for faint flashes of light that illuminated shadowy figures moving closer and closer. In the 12th room, the walls seemed to close in, and the air grew so thick they could barely breathe. By the time they reached the final room, Emily was shaking. The door was massive, carved with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness. "We made it," Chris said, though his voice lacked confidence. "Are we sure we want to go in?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. Emily pushed the door open, and the room beyond was unlike anything they had seen. It was a stark, white space with no furniture or decor. In the center stood a single mirror, its surface rippling like water. "What is this?" Chris asked, stepping closer. The mirror began to shimmer, and their reflections twisted and distorted. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and Emily felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Before anyone could react, hands reached out from the mirror, grabbing Chris and pulling him inside. "Chris!" Emily screamed, but he was gone. The mirror cracked, and the room began to shake violently. Emily and Sarah ran, their screams echoing through the house as the walls seemed to collapse around them. When they finally burst through the front door, the house was gone. They stood on an empty lot, the moonlight illuminating nothing but grass and dirt. Chris and Tyler were never seen again. To this day, Emily refuses to talk about what happened on Valley Ridge Road. But if you ask her what's in the final room, she'll simply shake her head and say, "Some things are better left unknown."